My own granddaughter looked me straight in the eye and told me she was gravely ill, and I kept her home to watch her lie. That's the truth of it. That's the bitter pill I've had to swallow. And I'm telling it now because, at 76, after a life spent building and protecting, I refuse to carry the burden of someone else's shame anymore. My name is Patricia Vance, and after 5 decades of observing human nature, raising 3 children, correcting thousands of college papers, and being Arthur's widow for 8 years, you'd think the petty tricks of the young couldn't shock me. Oh, honey, let me tell you something about aging. We don't get more naive, we just get quieter. We watch. I built this life with Arthur right here in this Dallas suburb. Our estate is solid, over $900,000 in assets. This house paid off. A good, respectable life. The kind of life that should be a shield against this kind of ugliness. My granddaughter, Isabel, 25, the light of my eyes, was staying with me to finish a design project. She was engaged to a wonderful young man, Daniel. They were supposed to get married in a few months. Everything looked perfect, like one of those magazine spreads I used to hate. Then came that morning at the breakfast nook where I've taken my coffee for 40 years. Isabel drifted down the stairs, pale as old lace. She told me she was sick, too weak to move. My old heart, the one that's seen too many years and too many losses, twinged for her. I sent her back to bed with sweet tea and the promise of my famous chicken soup. But after all these years, an instinct, one honed by life's little betrayals, just screamed at me. Isabel's paleness wasn't the flu. It was pure, unadulterated panic. I was being played. They thought my love was blind and my mind was slow. They thought I was just an old woman, easily managed, easily dismissed. They made a fatal error. They mistook my slowness for stupidity. They were about to learn that my slowness was just the time it took to sharpen the axe. This is the story of how a grandmother used decades of hard-won wisdom to expose a betrayal that threatened to tear my family apart. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, or if you just love a story where the old woman fights back, settle in with me. I'm going to tell you exactly how it all went down, piece by agonizing piece. Don't forget to subscribe right now so you don't miss a single moment of what they tried to keep secret. You know, the thing about having a good life, a quiet life, is that you get used to predictability. I could practically set my watch by the rising sun, by the way Arthur's picture catches the morning light, by the fact that the IRS is going to take too much of my pension. So when a young woman, someone you love fiercely, shows a kind of theatrical distress that feels off, your whole internal clock goes haywire. I spent the rest of that morning puttering around, humming old songs, making the chicken stock from scratch, the one with the bay leaf and a lot of heart. My hands, still steady enough for fine embroidery, were busy, but my mind was running through the inventory of my life. Isabel had been distant lately. She'd been snippy with Daniel on the phone, accusing him of prioritizing his job over her, and she'd been spending an awful lot of time texting. That's the 21st century version of whispering secrets, I suppose. It's impossible to ignore the small shifts in a person when you've watched them grow from a baby in a bassinet to a full-grown woman. After lunch, I took the soup up to her room, knocking softly. She was tucked under the quilt, looking dramatically pale. She whispered that she couldn't eat, that her fever was spiking, and that she'd asked Daniel not to call or visit for a few days, because the thought of talking to him was making her too anxious. My own grandchild, whom I had nurtured and encouraged all her life, was lying to me, and the look of fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of being sick. It was the fear of being caught. I left the tray and told her I'd be back later, retreating with the slowness and heavy footfall that they expect of a woman my age. But the moment I reached the landing, I was on alert. I heard the tiny ping of her phone on the bedside table. Now, my mother, God rest her soul, used to say, "Never look for trouble, Patricia, but if it sits down right next to you, don't ignore the chair." Isabel's phone was sitting right next to me. I crept back up. Isabel was turned away, seemingly asleep, a perfect picture of an invalid. Her phone, however, was face up, the screen lit with a text conversation. The little screen might be tiny, but my eyes, though they need reading glasses now, are sharp enough to see hypocrisy in daylight. My hands shook, I admit it. It wasn't the tremor of age. It was the fury of betrayal. I picked it up, feeling like a thief in my own home, and saw the messages. It wasn't with Daniel. It was with Brenda. Brenda, my niece's daughter, who was technically a cousin to Isabel, but whom I had always treated as another grandchild. Brenda, who always had that peculiar shade of green in her eyes whenever Isabel's life took a positive turn. The words were an ice bath. Brenda had encouraged Isabel to feign a serious illness to test Daniel. She told Isabel that a man who truly loved her would cancel all their wedding plans and sacrifice everything to prove his devotion. Brenda had actually written, "Tell him the doctor said it could be serious. If he backs out because of a little danger, you'll know the truth about him." My blood ran cold. This wasn't some silly girl drama. This was calculated emotional manipulation, a cruel game played with Daniel's feelings, and, worst of all, using my home, my care, and my age as the camouflage. Brenda had the nerve to write that I was old and wouldn't notice the deception. She told Isabel, "Your grandmother is old. She won't even notice you're acting. She'll just think it's worry. She won't even notice." That phrase cut deeper than any knife. They mistook my patience for senility. They thought I was a prop in their little play. But an old woman who spent her life observing the subtle currents of human interaction knows the difference between true worry and theatrical deceit. The deception wasn't Isabel's illness. The real sickness was the malice driving it. That night, when Daniel called, my voice was low, heavy with feigned exhaustion. I spoke carefully, planting the seed of the lie they wanted me to tell. I told Daniel, "She is very, very unwell. The doctor insists on absolute rest and zero stress. Please, don't visit, don't call for a whole week. She's confused right now." I was using their own script, but I was adding my own unwritten lines. I told Daniel that I was isolating Isabel from him, but the truth was that I was isolating the two of them from me, creating the perfect silence in which to plan my counterattack. My own granddaughter and the girl I considered family were using me as a pawn, hiding behind my supposed old-age confusion. They had misjudged me, and in that silence, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to let them succeed. The stakes were too high, not just for the wedding, but for the respect I had earned over 7 decades. The game had begun, and they didn't even know they were playing. I've always kept a good home, clean, orderly, everything in its place. It's not just a habit of my generation. It's a way of making sure that when chaos inevitably hits, at least the foundation is steady. That night, after I'd made the call to Daniel, a lie built on a foundation of their lies, I felt a different kind of order was needed. I needed to impose order on their messy, cruel deception. I made myself a strong cup of peppermint tea, sat down at my old roll-top desk, and started working. 76 years old, and I was turning into a private investigator, trading my red pen for a magnifying glass. The first thing a sharp mind does when confronted with treachery is to seek context. Why? Why would Isabel, who seemed to love Daniel, who had everything, play such a dangerous game? And why was Brenda, my niece's daughter, who was supposed to be a loving family member, cheering her on? I knew Brenda. She had always been a master of the quiet, resentful sigh, the sidelong glance, the kind of woman who measures her own happiness by the misery of others. But this felt too big for just jealousy. Betrayal of this caliber usually comes with a price tag. My first move was to reach out to my oldest friend, Dr. George Miller. George and I used to have lunch every Tuesday before Arthur passed. He's a retired psychiatrist, sharp as a tack, and he knows the landscape of the human mind better than anyone. I didn't tell him the whole story yet, not the whole shameful mess. I just asked him, in a hypothetical way, about intergenerational emotional manipulation. I wanted the technical term for what they were doing, this gaslighting, this using of my age and supposed decline as a shield for their actions. George was marvelous. He told me that my elephant memory, as he calls it, the ability to recall details from decades ago and link them to the present, was my best defense. He said the perpetrators often rely on the victim's isolation and self-doubt. That's when the true depth of their scheme hit me. They weren't just manipulating Daniel, they were trying to make me question my own clarity. Every time Brenda called to check on Isabel and cooed about how difficult it must be for me to manage, she was testing the waters, looking for a sign that I was slipping. I went back to Isabel's room under the pretense of fluffing her pillows. While she was half dosing, I quietly checked her trash can. Not the general one, but the small wastebasket she kept by her desk. Years of grading papers taught me that people throw away the most damning evidence. And there it was, a crumpled receipt from a high-end stationery store and a printed-out email. The receipt was for specialty paper and envelopes, the kind you'd use for official, important letters. The email was a draft of a request for a significant sum of money, an emergency loan to be given to Brenda by Isabel immediately following the wedding. It mentioned a due date, a high interest rate, and a bizarre phrase about sealing the deal. The sum was large enough to destabilize Isabel's newly acquired assets, and substantial enough to make Brenda's quiet envy turn into an outright obsession. It wasn't just jealousy, it was calculated financial exploitation. Brenda wasn't just trying to wreck the wedding, she was trying to extract a fortune. My entire body went cold. It wasn't just a spoiled grandchild testing a fiancé. It was a vicious, coordinated attack, using me and my home as the setting for their crime. They were not only trying to destroy Isabel's future with Daniel, but they were planning to bleed her dry, too. This whole sickness charade was designed to make Daniel pull back, making Isabel vulnerable and emotionally dependent on Brenda, the supportive cousin, just in time for Brenda to swoop in with her predatory loan request. I had been so focused on Isabel's emotional lie, I almost missed the ugly financial truth underneath it. They thought I was too old, too slow, too consumed with worry to notice a piece of crumpled paper. They thought the smell of my chicken soup would be enough to distract the old woman. But I wasn't distracted. I was calculating. I carefully smoothed the paper and tucked it into the secret drawer of my desk, the one Arthur had installed decades ago and swore he'd never tell anyone about. It's where I keep the original deed to this house and my wedding veil. Now, it held the first piece of concrete proof against them. My pain turned into a hard, cold resolve. They thought they were dealing with a confused, well-meaning old lady. They think I'm just a helpless old woman. They're about to learn otherwise. They're about to learn the difference between being old and being wise, and why you never underestimate a grandmother who knows exactly where to look for the things people try to hide. There's a strange power in being underestimated. It's like wearing an invisibility cloak woven out of wrinkles and soft voices. Once I understood the full scope of their plan, the emotional gaslighting to break Daniel, the financial exploitation aimed at Isabel, I realized the greatest weapon I had was the very thing they thought was my weakness, my age. They had decided I was senile, worried, and easily distracted. Fine. I would give them exactly what they expected. I put on my mask. The mask of the confused, overcaring grandmother is surprisingly easy to wear. It only requires a few extra sighs, a slight wobble in your step, and the careful misplacement of common objects. I started playing the part immediately. When Isabel would come downstairs for a brief, sick person appearance, I'd pat her hand with an almost frantic energy and repeat myself. I'd say, "Now remember, darling, the doctor said absolutely no stress. No stress. Did you call Daniel? You shouldn't call Daniel. I told the doctor." I'd trail off, pretending I couldn't recall the doctor's name, letting the sentence hang in the air like a forgetful cloud. Isabel would pat my hand back, the condescension thick in her touch, and say I was simply overwhelmed and tired. She told me that I needed to rest and that she could manage her own medication schedule, that I didn't need to worry about the calls. Her voice was too loud, too patient, exactly the tone people use when they think they're speaking to someone who might not grasp the meaning of the words. It confirmed my diagnosis. They truly believed I was slipping. The real challenge was Brenda. She started calling me multiple times a day, not to check on me, mind you, but to fish for details about Daniel's reactions. I learned the art of the carefully confusing response. I'd let my voice drop to a worried whisper and tell her things like, "Oh, Brenda, that sweet boy Daniel called, but I had to tell him Isabel was too confused to speak. He sounded so sad. I told him that Arthur had a blue tie, didn't he? I can't remember where I put the blue tie." I'd babble on about old, irrelevant memories, childhood Christmases, a recipe for candied yams, just enough noise to obscure the fact that I was completely lucid. Brenda ate it up. She told Isabel, in a text message I intercepted, that Grandma Pat is completely out of it. She thinks Daniel is her deceased husband. She's doing exactly what we need, isolating him for us. She's too far gone to be a risk. This was the opening I needed. I invited Brenda over for tea, ostensibly to have a chat about my Isabel, but really to gather more intelligence. I prepared the dining room, setting out the good china and putting my cane conspicuously near my chair. I made sure to mention that I had a terrible headache and was having a hard time concentrating before she even arrived. During our conversation, I steered the topic toward the financial side, leaning in close and lowering my voice conspiratorially. I told her, "Brenda dear, I worry so much about Isabel. You know, with this illness and the wedding expenses. Her trust fund is significant, almost all of it from Arthur's technology stocks. But with her being so distressed, I've been thinking about getting my own affairs in order. All those documents, all that money, it's a burden on my poor old brain." And that's when she made her fatal mistake, believing the mask of the confused widow. Brenda grew emboldened. She patted my hand, that infuriating, patronizing pat, and told me I was absolutely right to be concerned. She then, in a rush of greed and confidence, explained to me exactly how Isabel's finances were structured, mentioning which specific asset, a particular investment account I hadn't touched in 20 years, would be the easiest for Isabel to access quickly before the marriage contract was signed. She claimed she was just thinking ahead for Isabel, making sure my granddaughter was protected, but the specific insider information she gave me was a clear sign. Only someone who had spent weeks poring over Isabel's financial records, planning an illicit loan, would know those details. She laid out the entire financial pressure point, thinking I wouldn't understand or remember any of it. She assumed I was too far removed from the world of stocks and trust accounts to grasp the mechanics of a large withdrawal. I nodded slowly, widened my eyes a bit, and asked her if she'd like a third sugar cube. The sheer arrogance of her underestimation was breathtaking. I sat there, sipping my lukewarm tea, a frail old woman in a flowered dress, while she handed me the blueprint for her crime. She had given me the how, the when, and the where of the financial attack. She thought she was sharing a secret with a senile old woman. What she didn't realize was that she was confessing to a woman whose only remaining job in life was to protect her family, and that my mind was far sharper than the sterling silver she was drinking out of. Subtlety is the weapon of the aged, and by the time she finished her tea, I had everything I needed to destroy her scheme. When Brenda finally left my house, leaving behind the faint, sickly sweet scent of ambition, I didn't rush. I simply sat there for a long moment, allowing the silence to wash over me. That's another thing you learn when you get older. Sometimes the quiet after the storm tells you more than the thunder ever did. Brenda's detailed knowledge of Isabel's trust account wasn't the kind of information you just pick up casually. It meant she had been obsessively tracking Isabel's life, not just out of envy, but with a predatory focus. I picked up the good china, placed it in the sink, and then I went straight to the garage, not to rest, but to find my real resources. These children think life begins when they get their first paycheck, but a life well lived is a treasury of documentation. Decades ago, when Arthur retired, he taught me a few things about archiving. My files weren't on a cloud or a hard drive. They were in a series of perfectly labeled acid-free boxes. I was searching for the true motive. Jealousy could start the fire, but only greed could fuel it this long. I went straight for the Arthur's Will and Trust box, nestled behind a stack of old photo albums. Inside, I found the documents outlining the original trust fund terms, the ones established when Isabel was born. More importantly, I found a printout of an old, complicated spreadsheet Arthur had made regarding the entire family's inherited assets, a map of what everyone stood to gain and when. What I found was the ugly heart of the matter. Brenda's own mother, my niece, had made some very poor investments years ago and had been quietly struggling. Arthur had, with his big heart and his usual discretion, helped her out, but on the condition that Brenda, her daughter, would not be privy to any significant early inheritance to teach her responsibility. The spreadsheet showed that Brenda would only receive a modest, designated amount, and not until she was 40. Isabel, meanwhile, had immediate access to a significant portion of her trust fund upon her marriage to Daniel. The timeline clicked into place. Brenda was 30, 10 years away from the money she felt entitled to. She wasn't patient. She couldn't wait a decade for her share, while Isabel, the darling granddaughter, was about to unlock her assets by marrying a good man. Brenda's game was simple: destroy Isabel's life, get her on the financial hook with that predatory loan, and then use that new leverage to extort her for more funds, claiming it was her rightful inheritance being delayed. It was the purest form of inheritance impatience, wrapped in a cruel game of emotional sabotage. The depth of the betrayal made my teeth ache. They were not just playing with emotions. They were undermining the core principle of family, respect for the long view. Arthur and I had worked hard, planned for generations, and they saw fit to try and shortcut decades of wisdom and diligence for instant gratification. That's when I called my second resource. Not George this time, but my other dear friend, Evelyn, who still works as a paralegal at a major firm downtown. I didn't tell her the whole story, just that I needed her expertise on legal documents and privacy. I told her I was revisiting my own estate plan and needed to know exactly how difficult it would be for a married granddaughter to grant a large private loan, and what legal measures she could take to protect herself from manipulation. Evelyn, a sharp woman who has seen it all, immediately suggested I install an application on my phone that could discreetly record any incoming calls or texts, something to create a clean, irrefutable log of communication, a digital ledger of their deceit. I spent the rest of the evening learning how to use that application. It felt strange. This blending of my old-school determination with new technology, but I've always been a quick study. I wasn't just collecting texts anymore. I was creating a timeline, building a fortress of facts. I learned to forward the recorded conversations to Evelyn's secure account, ensuring that even if they found my phone, the evidence would be safe. I had the motive: inheritance, impatience, and greed. The method: emotional manipulation and the phony sickness. And now I had the means to expose them. My elephant memory, backed by digital evidence. The pieces were all there, scattered across the table of my life. Now, I just had to put them together for the grand finale. They wanted to use my age to make me look weak and confused. Little did they know that my age had given me the patience of a saint and the tactical mind of a seasoned chess player. Their scheme was a flimsy house of cards, and I was just waiting for the perfect moment to blow it all down. The beauty of a long life is the accumulation of things that seem worthless to others but hold immeasurable power in the right moment. For the next few days, I continued my performance, the role of the frail, distracted grandmother, now second nature. I was fussing over Isabel, bringing her extra blankets and bland food, all the while logging texts and calls. I even overheard a conversation between Isabel and Brenda, where Brenda told Isabel, "Just keep complaining. Tell Daniel you're having memory issues." The more erratic you seem, the more Grandma will cover for us, thinking it's her own confusion talking. It was disgusting, but every recorded word was another nail in their coffin. My allies were in place. Dr. George Miller, the wise psychiatrist, had validated my sanity, and Evelyn, the meticulous paralegal, was safeguarding the digital proof. But I still needed a physical resource, something undeniable, something that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or a simple, faulty memory of an old woman. I needed the smoking gun that was so old, so forgotten, that they wouldn't even think to destroy it. I needed to secure the link between Brenda's long-standing envy and the financial pressure her mother was under. I returned to my filing boxes. Arthur and I had always been good communicators, and even after his death, I kept his correspondence organized. I remembered a specific set of letters from 15 years ago, correspondence between Arthur and Brenda's mother dealing with that initial financial assistance. Deep in the Family Matters loans box, underneath a yellowed thank you note from a former student, I found it. A series of formal letters detailing the terms of the loan Arthur had provided, and more importantly, a handwritten addendum. This addendum, signed by Brenda's mother, explicitly stated that due to Brenda's demonstrated lack of financial responsibility during a short college stint, Arthur had restructured his will to ensure she would not receive her inheritance until the age of 40. This wasn't just proof of greed, it was proof of precedent. It showed that Brenda's current actions weren't a sudden lapse, but a long-standing character flaw that Arthur, with his foresight, had already tried to mitigate through his estate planning. This document explained why Brenda was so desperate and impatient now. She wasn't just envious of Isabel. She was furious at Arthur and me for daring to put limits on her. She saw Isabel's immediate access to funds as a personal insult, a judgment on her entire life. I knew that if I confronted them with the text messages and the financial blueprint, they could claim it was a joke or that I misinterpreted the context. But this letter, signed and dated, showed Arthur's original wise concern, directly contradicted Brenda's implied narrative of unfairness, and provided a motive that went back years. It was the crucial contextual evidence. The problem was that the paper was brittle. I couldn't risk leaving it in the box. I took 2 days to carefully, painstakingly transcribe the most damaging parts of the letter onto a fresh sheet of paper, notarizing my own signature to vouch for its accuracy. Then I drove slowly, making sure to look like an unsteady, worried elderly driver, to Evelyn's office. I didn't even go inside. I called her from the parking lot and told her I was leaving a very sensitive document for her to review and safeguard, emphasizing that it was old and concerned a past financial arrangement. I saw Evelyn's young associate come out to the curb, a look of professional caution on his face. I pressed the envelope into his hand, gave him a shaky, weary smile, and told him that sometimes the most important secrets are the ones that have been locked away the longest. As I drove home, I felt the lightness of my empty envelope-holding hand and a renewed weight of purpose in my heart. The evidence was safe. The document that proved Brenda was a long-term calculating opportunist, not a sudden convert to malice, was now in the hands of a lawyer who would not dismiss me as confused. They thought they had time. They thought I was their unwitting accomplice. They were about to discover that the old lady had not only secured her fortress, but had also planted explosives under theirs. They wanted a game of deceit, playing on my supposed weakness. They didn't realize they had walked into a legal ambush organized by a woman whose decades of life gave her access to records they didn't even know existed. It's an interesting thing to watch a lie fester. After I secured the evidence with Evelyn, my focus shifted from collection to observation. I was watching them, Isabel and Brenda, like a scientist watching 2 different types of mold grow. The sickness facade was deteriorating, and the tension between them was becoming a tangible thing in my quiet, orderly house. Isabel was the weak link. She was struggling to maintain the charade. She would come downstairs when she thought I was busy, not for food, but for the company of the light. I often caught her staring out the window, her face drawn, her eyes red, not from a fictional fever, but from genuine guilt. My heart ached for her, my poor granddaughter, caught between the decency I taught her and the wicked greed Brenda had fed her. I could tell she was terrified of disappointing me, but more immediately, she was terrified of disappointing Brenda, whose voice had taken on a sharp, demanding edge in their phone calls. I logged one text where Isabel mentioned that the lie was getting too complicated and that she felt sick for real now. Brenda's reply was viciously clear. She told Isabel that if she backed out now, she would be proving that she was a coward, and that she would miss out on the financial independence she supposedly deserved. Brenda didn't even mention Daniel anymore. It was all about the money, all about leveraging this fabricated crisis to force that loan through. Brenda was impatient, and her impatience was creating the perfect crack for me to exploit. This growing desperation confirmed what George had told me. Manipulators always increase the pressure when they sense their victim is wavering. Brenda had isolated Isabel from Daniel, but she was accidentally isolating Isabel from herself, forcing her to confront the ugliness of the plan. I knew I needed a confrontation that was inescapable, public enough to prevent denial, and emotionally significant enough to force a genuine response from Isabel. The drama needed a stage, and in our family, that stage had always been the weekly Friday night dinner. My children and grandchildren, all 20-something of them, including the spouses, gathered here every Friday. It was a tradition Arthur and I had started decades ago, a way to ensure that even with the geographical distances of adulthood, we were still fundamentally Vance. It was a sacred gathering, the place where all family matters were aired, celebrated, or quietly handled. The stakes would be highest there. No one could walk out easily. No one could deny the truth when the whole family, who knew every subtle glance and gesture, was watching. The next day was Friday. The confrontation had to happen right then, before Daniel, isolated and desperate, could do something rash, and certainly before Isabel, under Brenda's intense pressure, was forced to sign any financial documents. I called Daniel. I bypassed the lie entirely. I told him in a voice that left no room for doubt. Daniel, I know you've been worried. I need you here tomorrow night. It's Friday dinner. Don't call Isabel, don't tell anyone. Just show up. I didn't give him any information, but the sheer steel in my voice must have convinced him that the confused old woman was gone, replaced by the matriarch. Then I turned my attention to the final details. I knew Brenda would be at the dinner. She rarely missed a free meal and a chance to perform her concerned cousin act. I quietly made 2 more copies of the most damning text messages and the financial blueprint Brenda had given me. I put one set in my apron pocket and the other, along with the notarized copy of Arthur's old letter, I sealed in an envelope and instructed Evelyn to mail it to a neutral family friend only if I called her and told her to. I needed a backup, just in case they tried to destroy me completely. I finished setting the table, placing the heirloom silverware, the heavy, unforgiving kind that reflects the light brutally. I looked at the 19 settings around the long mahogany table. I was preparing not a meal, but a final judgment. They had tried to use their youth to manipulate my age. I went to bed that night, feeling a strange mixture of bone-deep exhaustion and razor-sharp clarity. I was 76 years old, and they were about to learn that the most dangerous thing in the world is a gentlewoman who has finally had enough. I would expose the lie, the greed, and the ultimate betrayal of trust in the most public way possible. Tomorrow, they would learn that age doesn't just bring wisdom. It brings the kind of patience that allows you to wait for the perfect moment, the moment where the truth can land with the force of a wrecking ball. They were expecting a pleasant dinner. They were about to get a family court hearing. That Friday night, the atmosphere in my dining room was thick, not with the smell of roast, but with a tension that only I seemed to fully perceive. The whole family was there, all the noise and chaos and love that defines us. Isabel was pale, even more so than her sick facade required, perched nervously beside Brenda, who was glowing with a terrible, self-satisfied confidence. Brenda kept patting Isabel's arm and giving me those fake concerned looks, as if to say, "Poor Grandma Pat. She's so overwhelmed." The moment came right after the first round of plates was cleared. I stood up slowly. I made sure to take my time, steadying myself on the back of my chair. I looked exactly like the aging matriarch they expected, maybe even a little fragile. The room fell silent instantly. When an old woman who rarely asks for attention finally demands it, everyone listens. I didn't start with an accusation. I started with a memory. I told them about Arthur and me 40 years ago, setting this table for the first time. I talked about the weight of history in this house, the decades of truth and love built here. I looked directly at Isabel, my voice clear and steady. I told them how worried I'd been about her fever, how I'd been up all night making her soup. "I've spent the last week," I said, my voice echoing slightly, believing that my granddaughter, Isabel, was desperately ill, perhaps facing a terrible disease that threatened her wedding, her future, and her life. Isabel flinched, her eyes widening. Brenda, sitting next to her, leaned forward and started to speak, a placating, concerned interruption about my memory issues. But I cut her off with a look that silenced her instantly. It was the look of a university professor dismissing a poorly researched term paper. "But tonight," I continued, "we have another guest, someone who, like me, has been isolated and lied to." Just then, the front door opened and Daniel walked in. He looked lost, desperate, and utterly confused. The collective gasp from the family was loud enough to shake the silverware. Isabel turned white. Brenda's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, cornered panic. Daniel stood by the doorway, looking from Isabel to me. I beckoned him forward. "Daniel, my dear boy," I said, "I told you to come here tonight because I owe you the truth about Isabel's sickness. I apologize for isolating you, but I was simply following the instructions given to me by my granddaughter and her cousin." I paused, letting that sink in. Then I pulled out my phone and placed it gently next to the butter dish, making sure the screen was clearly visible to everyone nearby. I looked straight at Isabel, who was now trembling. "When you called me, Daniel, I told you that Isabel was confused and needed rest. But you, wisely, followed up with the doctor. He told you she had no appointments, and you asked me why I was lying." I lowered my voice, making it intimate, confessional. "I was lying because I was being manipulated into doing so. They thought I was too old to notice, too fragile to understand, too worried about my precious Isabel to question the narrative." I pointed a finger, not shaking this time, but as firm as steel, directly at Brenda. Brenda here was the architect of this malicious deception. She advised Isabel to fake a grave illness to test Daniel's love, convincing her that a true fiancé would throw away his life and the wedding plans for a lie. Brenda jumped up, stammering that I was confused and misremembering, that I needed my medication. She was using the exact gaslighting script George had warned me about. I raised my voice just enough to override hers. "I have the proof, Brenda. My memory is just fine. It's my eyes that had to get sharper. I found the communication where you explicitly coached Isabel on the lie, suggesting she use her health to manipulate Daniel, and then confirming that I, quote, won't notice what was happening." I pointed to the phone screen, showing a brief, magnified image of the most damning text about my old age. Then I delivered the final, devastating blow, the one that revealed the true, ugly motive. But this wasn't just a cruel game of testing love. This was about money. Brenda's financial plan, which she foolishly shared with the confused old woman, was to use Isabel's emotional distress to force her to grant a massive, predatory loan, a loan motivated by her own years of resentment over Arthur's estate planning. I pulled the copies of the financial blueprint and Arthur's old letter from my apron and slapped them onto the table. The sound was deafening in the silence. Isabel looked at the evidence, looked at Brenda's trapped, panicked face, and then she broke. She wasn't sick anymore. She was heartbroken. She threw herself into Daniel's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, confessing the whole miserable truth right there in front of everyone. Brenda tried to make a break for the door, but my son, her uncle, was blocking the way, his face a mask of shock and shame. The climax was complete. The silence that followed Isabel's desperate confession was more powerful than any shouting match. It was the silence of a family realizing that the person they had dismissed as frail and forgetful was, in fact, the only one strong enough to expose the rot and fight for the truth. The whole family was watching the gentle old lady who loved them all, and in that horrifying, beautiful silence, they saw that my strength wasn't in my youth or my speed, but in the truth I had patiently waited to reveal. They had misjudged my love for blindness, and they had paid the price. The silence after Isabel's confession was a heavy, suffocating thing. It wasn't the kind of quiet that precedes a storm, but the kind that follows a lightning strike, the world reorienting itself after a violent, blinding flash. Brenda, cornered and exposed, tried one last desperate move. She screamed that I was a bitter old woman who hated seeing her niece's family happy, that the letter was faked, and that Isabel was just too weak to stand up to me. But her voice cracked. The family didn't need me to respond. They had seen the truth in Isabel's tears and Brenda's own panicked eyes. My son, the kindest and gentlest of the Vances, simply walked her to the front door, his silence a profound judgment. "You are not welcome here, Brenda," he said, his voice low and devastated. "Not until you understand what family means." When the door closed on her, the room remained motionless. Everyone was staring at Isabel, still weeping into Daniel's embrace. Daniel, who was initially pale with shock, held her tighter. His anger was clearly directed not at her, but at the manipulation. He looked up at me, his eyes full of gratitude and a deep, new respect. He didn't ask if the wedding was off. He simply held his fiancée and stroked her hair. That was my answer for him. I waited until Isabel was calm enough to sit back down. I didn't scold her. I didn't lecture her. I looked at her, and my heart was full of the complicated love of a grandmother who knows that sometimes the hardest lessons come from the people you trust. "Isabel," I said, my voice now soft but firm, "the sickness was not a fever. The sickness was greed and envy, and it was contagious. You were a victim of her manipulation, but you were also a participant in a cruel lie against a good man and a family that loves you." I paused, and she nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "The wedding," I stated, "will not be cancelled, but it will be postponed. Not because of a false illness, but because you need time to heal, and Daniel needs time to trust again. You need to prove to him, and more importantly, to yourself, that you are marrying him for love, not because you were rushed into it before an imaginary deadline." Daniel instantly agreed, his hand tightening around Isabel's. The family murmured their support. The decision was final and uncontroversial. It was not a punishment, but a necessary reset, a cleansing of the ugly foundation the lie had attempted to build. Isabel looked at me then, her eyes swimming with remorse. "Vovo," she whispered, "I am so sorry. I didn't know how deep it was. I was so scared of disappointing Brenda, and I let her tell me you wouldn't notice, that your age meant you. You couldn't see." I smiled, a small, tired smile. "Darling," I said, "my age means I have seen enough to know the difference between acting and truth. It means I know where the bodies are buried, both literally and figuratively. You underestimated your grandmother, and you underestimated the long, quiet love that protects a family. The ultimate consequence, the final act of dignity, came the following week. I drove to my lawyer's office, not Evelyn, but my estate attorney. I updated my will. Brenda's name was removed completely from any and all future disbursements. I redirected that portion of my assets to a local charity that supports women starting small businesses. It was a reminder that legacy is about dignity and contribution, not entitlement. Today, Isabel and Daniel are married. They took their time, built their trust back, and had a beautiful wedding right here on the lawn, where I first noticed the lie. They are stronger now. As for me, the house settled back into its quiet rhythm. The aroma of chicken stock no longer masked a lie. It was a scent of comfort and healing. I often think about the phrase Brenda used. She won't even notice. Oh, but I did. I noticed everything. And in the end, that quiet notice was my greatest victory. The world moves fast now, with these little phones and quick words, and people think the past is irrelevant. But a life lived fully is your best weapon. Don't let anyone, especially the young and impatient, tell you that your wisdom is weakness or that your memory is failing. They mistake slowness for stupidity, and that is their greatest, most expensive mistake. I tell you this because every grandmother has a tale that needs to be told, a lesson learned that should be passed down. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you want to hear more tales from a woman who's seen too much to stay quiet, go ahead and subscribe to my channel right now. Because I'm 76 and I'm just getting started.